There is no photograph of them together. That is the first thing to understand about the relationship between Edith Piaf and Josephine Baker. Two women who defined Paris for the world, whose names appeared in the same reviews and the same breathless columns, who moved through the same cabarets and the same dressing-room corridors, and no photograph exists of the two of them in the same frame. That absence is not an accident, and it is not the whole story. Paris in the late 1940s was a city in the middle of reconstructing itself. The war had ended, the occupation had ended. The specific kind of shame and pride that a city carries after 4 years of enemy occupation was settling into something more complicated. The need to be Paris again, to be the city the world expected it to be. The cabarets reopened, the music halls filled. The performers who had survived the occupation returned to the stages they had left or found new ones. And Piaf and Baker were both there, in that city, in those years, doing what they had always done. The Paris entertainment world of the late 1940s was not large. The music halls and the cabarets and the theaters were concentrated in a specific geography: Montmartre, the Grands Boulevards, the neighborhoods around the Opéra, and the performers who worked in them were aware of each other in the specific way of people who share a city and a profession and a late-night schedule. Piaf knew who was in the other room. Baker knew who was selling out the next theater. In that world, at that moment, two women at the absolute heights of their respective careers were operating within a few kilometers of each other on most nights of the performing week. They were not the same. This is the thing the absence of the photograph might suggest, that the two women kept careful distance because they were rivals. But that is not the reason. The reason is more interesting. The understanding was this: what they did on a stage was the same thing, produced through entirely different means. Baker was spectacle, the costume, the production, the elaborate visual apparatus of the revue that surrounded and amplified her presence. Piaf was reduction, the black dress, the single microphone, the voice stripped of every distraction. They were the opposite ends of the same purpose: to make the room feel something it had not felt before walking in. This is the first payoff, and it changes how you hear both of them. Baker's spectacle was not the opposite of Piaf's minimalism. It was another answer to the same question. The question being, how do you reach a room full of people who came in from the evening thinking about other things and make them stop thinking about other things entirely? Baker, in this account, asked Piaf a question. The kind of question that only someone who is also a performer can ask another performer without condescension. How do you hold a room when you give them so little to look at? The room goes quiet at this point. Not theatrical quiet. The ordinary quiet of people waiting to hear an answer they are not certain the person can give. Piaf's answer was not what Baker expected. She did not talk about technique or voice or the choice of songs. She said, she did not hold the room. The room held her. That the thing she did was not a performance of presence, but the actual thing. That she went onto a stage and she was there entirely, and the room recognized it because rooms always recognize the actual thing when it appears. This is the second payoff, and it reframes everything you know about how Piaf worked. She was not performing presence. She was present. The distinction sounds small. It is not small. And here is the detail that changes the shape of everything that came before. Baker was not asking out of professional curiosity. She had been watching Piaf perform for years, from the wings, not from the audience. From the position in which you see exactly what someone is doing rather than what the audience is receiving. Baker had watched Piaf from the wings because she was trying to understand something she had not been able to name. Piaf's answer named it. Baker already knew this. She needed to hear it said by someone who knew it from the same inside. Josephine Baker had been a sensation in Paris since the 1920s. She had arrived from St. Louis, a young black American woman in a city that received her with the complicated combination of fascination and projection that the Paris of the 1920s brought to the subject of blackness. She had made herself into a legend on those terms, and then, over the decades, had gradually transformed that legend into something entirely different, something more serious, more political, more deeply connected to the France that was not only a city of spectacle, but a country at war with what it believed about itself. During the occupation, she had worked for the French resistance. She had carried intelligence across borders, had used her performance schedule as cover, had put herself in the kind of danger that the word performer does not usually encompass. She had risked her life for France, and France, in the late 1940s, knew this. Piaf's relationship with the occupation was more complicated. She had performed during the war, had traveled to prisoner-of-war camps in Germany under the arrangement that allowed French performers to entertain French prisoners, and had used those visits to help facilitate false identity papers for Jewish prisoners, photographs taken during performances, documents quietly forged. She had navigated the specific impossibility of being a French performer in occupied France with the combination of survival instinct and quiet resistance. She was not Baker. But what she had done in those camps was not nothing. But here is what most people who wrote about both women missed entirely. In the dressing rooms and corridors and backstage rooms of the Paris performance world, what mattered was not the politics of the occupation. What mattered was the work. And on the subject of the work, Piaf and Baker had more to say to each other than the official histories of either woman suggest. Baker's French was, by the late 1940s, fully her own. The French of a woman who had chosen to live and build her life in the language, who had become French in the ways that mattered most, not through documentation, but through the specific relationship to a place that comes from having been willing to risk yourself for it. Piaf's French was the French of Belleville and Pigalle, direct, weighted, the instrument and the voice inseparable. In that French, in the backstage world that neither woman had been born into, and that both had made entirely their own, they understood something about each other that required no explanation. Baker heard this and was quiet for a moment. The accounts describe her expression as suggesting the answer had arrived somewhere it was not entirely expected to arrive. And then she said something in return. The consistent element across all accounts is that she agreed, with the specific quality of someone who has been saying the same thing in a different register for 20 years and has just heard it said plainly. Two women in a backstage room agreeing about the essential thing. No camera present, no journalist, no record except the memory of the people in the room. There is no photograph because the photograph would have required stopping what was happening long enough to arrange it. And what was happening did not stop. The conversation continued into the corridor, into the evening, into the shared understanding of what it meant to have built a life out of the specific act of standing in front of rooms full of people and giving them something real. Paris has always had two voices. The voice of spectacle, the folie bergère, the elaborate revue, the show that dazzles before it moves. And the voice of the essential, the café-concert, the chanson, the song that enters through the ear and goes directly somewhere the eye cannot reach. Both of these voices had, in the post-war years, a face. Baker was one, Piaf was the other. Baker went on performing until 1975. She was 68 years old when she died, 4 days after her final opening night, to the reviews that called it the greatest performance of her career. Piaf was gone by 1963. The years between their backstage conversations and the end of each of their lives were years in which Paris changed and the cabarets changed. But the essential thing they had agreed about, in a backstage room, without a camera, without a journalist to record the exact words, did not change. The performing was the thing. The room and the voice and the people in the seats who left for a night thinking about nothing except what they had just received. That was the thing. And both women knew, without needing it confirmed, that the other one had it. 2 voices, 2 stages, 1 understanding. And no photograph that could have said what the recordings say more quietly and more completely every time someone presses play. There is a version of this story that ends with the absence, the missing photograph, the undocumented encounter. But the absence is not the point. The point is, what was there when no camera was watching? 2 women from entirely different worlds, in a backstage corridor of post-war Paris, agreeing about the one thing that neither of them had ever been able to stop doing. No explanation required. No photograph necessary. The room already knew.